To start us off, I have the great pleasure of introducing our opening session with experts holding many decades of experience as leaders in the energy space. Please help me welcome Dr. Amy Glasmeier, Professor of Economic Geography and Regional Planning from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Amy.
I'm just going to make a very few introductory comments and ask my colleagues who are going to be the primary source of discussion today. Coming up on the stage with me now is John Mingé, who has been with British Petroleum for 35 years. I'll say a little bit more about him in a minute. And the second guest is John Hofmeister, who also has been a leader in the oil and gas industry as the, and I'll say a little bit more in a minute about that. So this introductory panel is really designed to sort of set the stage for the next couple of days, or the next 36 hours, which is interesting to think about time in that way. And I just want to make a few comments about time. So I just got back from China. I was in Beijing for 4 days. And I've been going to China since 1989. And in 1989, almost no one owned a car. You traveled in a bus. The food supply was meager. And the heating system for most residences were cubes of pressed perforated coal. And all through the streets, you would see these carts carrying these cubes of coal. And this was the source of a significant number of the people's energy supply. I went back in 2006, and I was sitting and working in Hong Kong, and I looked across, and I could see that the landscape was changing, that the mainland was beginning to evolve. And I happened to be studying the global watch industry, so I was talking about factories, and it was made clear to me that basically the industry had left Hong Kong and moved into China, and tens of thousands of people were working in it. I went back again in 2011, and it was a completely different environment. I was in Shanghai and Beijing, and the buildings were growing at an unbelievable pace, and the sky was becoming darker, visibly darker from the industrialization process that was occurring. The land was primarily denuded of vegetation, which actually was one of the distinguishing features back in 1989. I just got back, and I can say that in a mere 30 years, this country of 1.3 billion has changed dramatically. Everything has changed. The landscape has changed. When you're in Beijing, you can't find a speck of dirt that doesn't have a tree on it or some type of vegetation. At the same time, you feel this foreboding that the sky is going to come down upon you. The first day I was there, it was clear. The second day, we were having a hard time seeing the planes taking off at the airport. And in the hotel that I was staying in, they recommended that you didn't drink the water from the faucet. But the point is that in 30 years, I was in a primarily rural country, and 30 years later, I was in a remarkably urbanizing country, and they were facing some of the greatest challenges that humans could possibly face, which is the caustic consequences of industrialization. So today's discussion is really about how do we take time into account when we think about the future? How do we believe it's possible that we can actually change the world in a short period of time? How do we conceive of the possibility that we can achieve some sort of control over the negative effects of climate change? So our discussion today is going to be part about the global energy system as it is, but also far-reaching visions of where we've been and where we're capable of going if we all basically pull together. So with that, I will begin by sitting over here and asking my colleagues some questions. So John Mingé has been at BP for 35 years, most recently as the chairman and president of BP America. He now chairs the National Petroleum Council study on carbon capture and use and storage. John, tell me about your career, what it's been like to be the president of a major energy company, and what you and BP are thinking about with respect to the industry's future.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. And first of all, thank you all for inviting me and for being here. And I'm really excited to participate in this event with you while I'm here. So, yeah, 35 years ago, I was a kid in Washington State, grew up on a farm. Nobody in my family had ever gone to college. And I went off to university, got an engineering degree, and had no idea what I wanted to do, and ended up really wanted a job in Alaska. And so I interviewed with a company called Ohio, and because they had big operations in Alaska, and went to the interview and was successful. Got to the second interview, but every single time I said Alaska, they said Cleveland. And so I ended up going into the oil and gas industry, but starting with Ohio in the great state of Ohio, and had no idea what I was getting into. But over the course of my career, I spent time in the U.S., 12 years overseas, and then finally back to Alaska before this other job. But it's just fascinating, opportunities. I never would have ever expected to grow to the levels of seniority that I did. I feel very fortunate and lucky, and had some great people along the way that helped me. One of them sitting right over there, Gary Dirks. But energy is it's just so important to the world. Both you guys have said it. I've had an opportunity. One of the jobs that I did was I was a business unit leader for our business in Vietnam. And when I was there in 2004 to 2007, the GDP per capita was about between $300 and $400 a year. So it's the 13th most populated country in the world with 80 million people, and most families lived on less than $1 a day. And they're fortunate in that country because it's warm and there's enough food, and so people, I actually practiced one weekend, and I could live on probably $5 a day. You actually get a hotel room, get some food, get one beer. You had to ration yourself to one beer, but for $5 to $6 a day. Anyway, we had a project there where we were doing oil and gas. It was a gas operation. We had an offshore facility, onshore facility. We built a 760 megawatt gas-fired power plant. And that supplied 40% of that country's electricity. And, we used to say that, 4 out of 10 light bulbs in that country were running because of us. And you saw what it did to people. You saw what it did to hospitals. You saw what it did in terms of as that country was trying to come out of really some pretty extreme situations and became part of the WTO and the market-led growth that was happening, and how energy was a part of that. And so those kind of experiences were great. I'll just say right now, the world is facing there's a dual challenge. Just like Mike was saying, population is growing and people are coming out of poverty. And so with that, demand of energy is going up. There's a lot of different outlooks. Ours would say that there's going to be 30% growth in energy out to 2040. That's a lot of energy. And at the same time, people are more and more worried about our climate and the fact that the globe is warming. And so what we need is we have to have that energy, but it's got to be with less emissions. And, countries are going to demand the energy because people are going to demand it. So it's going to come from somewhere. And the world has more energy than it'll ever use. There's oil, there's gas, there's coal, there's biomass, there's nuclear, there's tidal, there's solar, wind, there's lots of it. And all of them have different price points, and all of them have different carbon footprints. And policymakers around the world are going to make choices about what energy sources are going to meet that demand. So right now, what we're working on and is to be part of that energy transition and do it in a positive way, and it's exciting. And if I were starting my career today, it would be just as fascinating as what I've had the last 30 years. So.
Great, thank you. So John Hofmeister is a true oil and gas insider. He currently has been the founder and CEO of Citizens for Affordable Energy since 2008. And before that, he was the president of Shell Oil Company. As we prepared for our event today, he sent us all Shell produces a scenario document every several years that gives a forecast for the future of the global energy and how the changes are occurring. And the most recent one is called Sky, and I hope that you'll say a bit about it. It's been 10 years since you've left Shell and started your nonprofit. Tell me about your career, how energy has changed over the last decade, and what global energy trends you see on the horizon.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you all for inviting me here today. I think that I've been surrounded by electrons and molecules for the last 50 plus years. Molecules and electrons are energy. That's what we use, either the molecules for fuel or the electrons for all the electricity that we consume. For the larger part of my career, I was involved in consuming electrons. I started my career at GE. I transitioned to Northern Telecom, a telecommunications company, and then into Allied Signal, which is now Honeywell, in the aerospace world. All of which are all three companies using equipment, building equipment that use and consume or produce the equipment that makes electrons. And so whether it's jet engines or whether it's power turbines, whatever it is, that's been 25 years of my career. The last 20 years of my career, I've been associated with oil and gas. 11 years at Royal Dutch Shell, 10 years since I retired from corporate life, working in the education of molecules and electrons with Citizens for Affordable Energy. I found, as president of Shell Oil, a nation, and at the time we were hitting $5 a gallon gasoline, a nation that was disturbed and perturbed over high-priced energy, but didn't know why, didn't understand how we could have $5 gasoline and what that meant to the individual family. And electric bills were going up. So we're now looking at not 8-cent kilowatt hours, we're looking at 16-cent kilowatt hours and higher at peak hours than that. And so people's electric bills, gas bills, and gasoline requirements, all more expensive. So I started Citizens for Affordable Energy after leaving corporate life for the purpose of acquainting grassroots Americans with the reality of energy and what the future holds. I've had the good fortune of being connected to Arizona State Global Institute of Sustainability, as well as being on the faculty of Kansas State University and University of Houston. And then I have a whole program of outreach where I've been all over the country talking about the future of energy. So what I'm thinking about is this age of transition, and you mentioned Sky. Sky is, for all the reading that I do, it's about a 3-hour read. You can go to the Royal Dutch Shell website. I'm not promoting Shell, but I am promoting scenarios, because scenarios teach us and stretch our thinking. Sky, uniquely, was just published this year, and it explains what's required to manage the transition period to achieve the goals and objectives of the Paris Accords. The Paris Accords are designed, 195 nations reaching agreement in principle on how to maintain global warming at a 2 Celsius or preferably a 1.5 degree Celsius uplift between now and 2070. That is a huge undertaking. That is an incredible task that will challenge government, corporations, and citizens to think and do differently in the energy space over the next 50 years. And the requirements of Sky were falling behind by the day. In other words, you can see the outline of what's needed, and it's pretty significant. We are so far off the mark, ladies and gentlemen, that if we don't get going soon, we have no chance to achieve what's established in the Paris Accords, starting with the price on carbon. Is there a price on carbon? And so far, we've been unsuccessful from a public policy standpoint of even seriously considering a price on carbon or removing CO2 from the atmosphere. We can achieve a net zero carbon in the atmosphere over the next number of decades with the use of technology, but we don't even talk about it at this point. So we've got a long way to go. So I look forward to our conversation because we can go deeper into all of these topics. The transition is upon us. How are we going to handle it is the question.
Let me continue with you for a minute. So I know that you have a really strong passion for electrification. And it turns out that we were both at the MIT has an energy institute, the MIghty dinner, in which the director of the private utility that is responsible for energy generation in Hawaii had said that they had made a commitment that by 2050 they would be 100% essentially energy neutral. But what does it take to actually achieve something like that? In that discussion, it was so interesting because the speaker, talked about the sort of challenges and the weaknesses of the existing system. And so how will electrification change in order for us to try to get to Paris?
Well, this is where geography plays a role. Hawaii, as everybody knows, is standalone. It's unique. It's near tropical. It has no inherent natural resource base except nature. In other words, there are no minerals. There's no oil. There's no natural gas. There's no coal in Hawaii. So if you're going to use fossil fuels, it has to be imported. But every day there's sunshine. Every day there's wind. And there's a lot of water in Hawaii. So you have a combination of hydropower, wind, and solar that if you really put your mind to it, you don't need to rely upon imported coal, which they do today or are in the process of phasing out today. You don't need to rely upon shiploads of oil, crude or finished product, for transportation. You can electrify your transportation fleet in an isolated island type environment. And to the extent that you can capture the wind, and I have personal experience in looking at building a very large wind farm in Hawaii when I was president of Shell, with a hydropower backup for storage. So we had a hydro system that would generate electricity when the wind wasn't blowing, built into the design. Now, the local politics led to not building that project eventually, but that's another story. But now the commitment to be CO2 free in Hawaii is very doable. But if you transfer that same logic in Hawaii to, let's say, the megalopolis of Boston to Washington on the east coast of the US, heaven help you. The consumption of electrons and the consumption of fuels, it's impossible to do with wind and solar and hydropower between now and 2050. It won't happen. There's just too much demand. Geography matters, population matters. And so I think the Hawaii probability is very high if they have a plan and they stick to it to make the transition, but other parts of the country or other parts of the world, not so.
So John Mingé, obviously technical challenges are only one part of the discussion. And as John H. Referred to, there are many other elements that go into achieving any type of energy generation. And your experience in Vietnam is very telling, the scale that you were working at. We all know that energy is fraught with political consequences and geopolitical struggles in the regions in where a lot of it is generated. Can you talk a little bit about how geopolitics fits into this picture?
Yeah. I mean, what we do as an international oil company is we produce energy that produces heat, light, and mobility for people. And the international oil companies probably they produce less than 10% of the world's oil. Most of the resources are with the national oil companies, with nations. And even in other nations like America, it's either, lower 48 is private citizens or the federal government, but they're countries. So what we do is working with governments, we make investments in different parts of the world, and we bring skills and technology and capital to actually develop the energy that country needs. The energy, as we've been talking about, is really as essential as the air we breathe and the water we drink in terms of society and in terms of society's prosperity. So it's absolutely essential. But just like Mike showed earlier, the energy wasn't evenly distributed around the globe. And there are countries, you can look at it, who's got the resources? Well, Russia, Iran, Saudi, Iraq, Libya, the United States, and I'm probably missing many, and some have more oil, some have more gas, some have more coal, but what we do as a company is we work in areas where there are resources and make investments, and we create jobs, and we train and develop people. So by the very nature of what we do, we get in the middle of geopolitics. We sometimes are the executives that bridge gaps between countries, with energy ministers or with policymakers and things like that, and it makes the job fascinating. My sense is all the places that I've been and I've around the world and worked is some people would question, well, how can you work there because of human rights? Or, I worked in a communist country. How can you be invested? Well, we're a force for good. We have our code of conduct. We have the way that we do business. We develop talent in that organization, and I've got so many examples of by being there, that society is better. And I love it, and I loved it, and I think it's the nature of what we do. It makes it exciting, it makes it interesting, but it's not like we go out to engage in geopolitics. We do because that's how important energy is to a country's development and their economic prosperity.
So, John, sort of following from the discussion of geopolitics, the biggest challenge, it would seem, is the growth of energy demand in the developing world. And having just come back from China, it's just extraordinary to have seen the change in 30 years. What do you see being the scale of the demand of global South countries, as an example, as they seek to develop and to increase their prosperity and their well-being?
Well, again, let's reference the geographies of the developing world and whether or not they have access to either the minerals that produce electrons and fuels, molecules, I should say, or do they have other sources like wind and solar and hydropower? But I think one of the critical elements for developing world countries is what's the whole world going to be doing meanwhile? Because we saw Mike's chart at the beginning where the global demand for energy is going to be up 30%. A lot of that, yes, in developing world countries. I spent last week in Cape Town, South Africa, at the Africa Oil Conference. And what most people do not know, because it really hasn't been broadcast very far, is that the amount of fossil fuel offshore Africa, east, west, south, northwest, is enormous. And all the oil ministers were there. And they're all talking about developing the fossil fuel wealth of their countries from Mozambique and Kenya and Somalia on the east to Namibia and Congo and the West African countries of Mauritania and so on up the northwest coast. There's going to be a huge explosion of fossil energy, natural gas and oil coming from the continent of Africa, which from a developing world standpoint is essential. But here's something about the world which we should recognize. We're all familiar with the efforts to expand electrification of the personal transportation fleet. And for disclosure purposes, I'm well invested in a lithium and boron mine and part of the board of directors of a company that's going to supply lithium to battery makers in the future. Having said that, the personal transportation fleet only represents 20% of the oil demand in the world. So if we go to 100% electricity for personal vehicles, that only touches 20% of the oil consumption, and it may slow down global oil demand. But when it comes to heavy freight, when it comes to aviation, when it comes to marine, when it comes to petrochemicals, the global demand for oil is going to continue to grow over the course of the next 20, 30 years, based on projections from the major oil companies as they see it. And also the IEA and also the EIA, which are pretty authoritative sources given that they represent either the OECD countries or the United States of America. So there's a lot of credibility there. But from a developing world standpoint, the population of Namibia is 2 million people. They're not going to consume a lot of their own energy. It's going to be exported. Mozambique, a few million people. And so they will take enough to supply themselves with modernization coming into the 21st century type economy, and bless them for it. They'll change their quality of life, their standard of living, but they will also, and every one of those oil ministers mentioned it last week, they will develop alternative energy as well. They have sunshine galore in the continent of Africa. And being close to the coast, they have lots of wind. And they're not going to miss out on those opportunities. So I think it'll be an exciting time in the developing world for energy expansion and energy and the quality of life that comes from it.
So John, let's take you out of the global south and into the United States. Based on this discussion, what do you see the outlook is for the United States, and what are some of the largest challenges we face?
Mm-hmm. Well, so when you look at the fact that the energy demand is growing, and it's kind of in all sources, and you really do need an all of the above. And the U.S. has done a tremendous job on renewables. It is the fastest growing, but it also needs, there are certain things that solar and wind can't do, electricity can't do. They can't work in petrochemical. You need higher heat in petrochemicals. You can't make cement. You can't make steel. Many of the products, that people use every day that's ubiquitous across society can't be made without industrial heat or industrial processes where you need natural gas or hydrocarbons. The U.S. has been blessed with an abundance of hydrocarbons. There's a lot of it. And we know the world is going to continue to need it, and it's going to need more and more forms. As I look at how important our sector is to the economy, and kind of all you need to do is go back and look at what was happening in the financial meltdown of 2008 and 2009. And there was really only one industrial sector that was booming, and it was the oil and gas, and it was the shale renaissance, and the ingenuity of America that was driving a surge, and it was creating low-cost energy for business and for people. It was creating lots of jobs. It was creating tax revenues. It was creating royalties. And it was super, super important. As I look at the world and the need for lower emissions from the energy, and then I look at the fact that we are blessed with an abundance of resources, who would you rather have produce energy that, for the world than Americans, you know? And would you rather have the resources developed in Russia or Iran or other places? So the problem is that at times energy, this whole debate gets political. And there's people on one side of the fence that may want to keep it in the ground, and another side of the fence that are deniers. But I think most Americans are in the middle, you know. And I think the more people can come together and say, you know what, the Paris goals are real. It is, you know, you read this. I read this scenario, the sky scenario. I mean, it'll scare you, you know, when you look at actually what is needed in this world, and it's not going to be one or the other. It's going to be all. If you look at the Paris goal and you say within that curve how much oil, just crude oil, how much the world needs under Paris, I don't know if it's 2 degree scenario or 1.5. But if you look at it, it's 84 million barrels of oil. Today we're at 97. So it's a reduction, but it's still a lot of oil. If you stopped investing in oil right now and just you had the divestment movement and said, quit, stop, we've got enough, with a 3% reservoir decline rate, which is not, I mean, generally it's higher, 3%, by 2040 we'd be at 47 million barrels of oil per day. We'd be short 40 million barrels a day. Guess what would happen in this world? Guess, you know, what kind of, the economy would implode. So that's the kind of understanding that you kind of got to get to. And I think the U.S. is well placed, and we are blessed with so much, and we need to be part of it. I'm excited about the future.
So let's continue with the discussion about the U.S. So John, your firm is based in D.C., and you no doubt have a front row view of what's going on in the sort of politics of energy in the U.S. With the midterm elections behind us and the future in the next couple of years, how do you think lawmakers and regulators can most effectively manage the energy system? How do we attempt to achieve the sky projections given politics of today?
I show a videotape to my classes of 8 presidents in a row promising U.S. energy independence, starting with Richard Nixon and moving through every president from Richard Nixon to Barack Obama, promising energy independence for America. President Trump is not on that videotape, but we know that his philosophy towards energy is energy abundance. He's stated it clearly. And that implies energy independence. We are not energy independent. Whatever headline you may read, however misinterpreted media may be about our energy status, every day, 7 days a week, we consume 7 million barrels of imported oil in this country. Yes, we're blessed, as John said, with an abundance of natural resource, but we have 7 million barrels a day imported into this country that if we didn't have it in the 20 million barrels of oil we use every day, we'd be energy poor. We wouldn't be able to fill our gas tanks. We'd have gas lines around the block every day. That's a way of saying that public policy has failed us, ladies and gentlemen. We have an election every 2 years. And these midterms are a good example. So were the midterms of 2010, 12, and 14. Things change. Elected officials and policymakers take a 2-year view of what they're able to do. We cannot achieve the energy transition looking forward if we maintain that kind of a 2-year approach to public policy. I've been up and down the halls of Congress, the halls of the agencies of the executive branch for decades. And you always have a nice chat, you always have a smile, you always have a happy member that you've talked to, but we don't get anything done. It's because the time perspective of 2 years is not long enough to deal with energy demands that extend over decades of time. So I'm not optimistic about the current role of public policy in the way we manage our energy. And we don't think we have time for the solution to be described adequately. But I've written about it in a book I wrote called Why We Hate the Oil Companies. And there are solutions out there to the public policy dilemma, but that's what we should be pursuing, because the every 2-year approach doesn't help us.
So John, one of the issues that people often don't fully understand is the degree of diversification that oil companies engage in, and that in a number of the renewable energy sectors, that the oil companies are also really involved in that. Can you talk a bit about BP's role?
Yeah, I mean, we jumped out 20 years ago a little bit ahead of the curve and invested about $10 billion in renewable energy, and probably wrote off most of that, as the investments didn't work out. We were a little ahead of our time. I'm getting a stop right there.
All right.
That's pretty aggressive. But so what I would say is it's absolutely a part of our company. We see the energy transition coming. We want to be part of it. We're investing in, part of our strategy is advancing the energy transition through investments in venturing and in low carbon products, through a reduce our emissions, improve the products that we make for lower emissions, and create new businesses and new opportunities. And we're investing about $500 million a year, which, and that is growing. We're part of it. It's pretty exciting what's happening. And at the same time, the world is going to need oil and gas for many, many years, and it can fit within the Paris Accords. But more and energy transitions take time. But it's an exciting time for our business. There's lots to do, and technology is moving fast.
Well, so it's often, it's very unlikely to have two Johns on the stage together. So you've done a great job with me sort of kind of eyeballing you. So thank you very much, and this is a great way to set the next 36 hours, and the Johns will be here for you to talk with them. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.
Thank you.